So what is a gland? A gland is a cell or groups of cells of specialized epithelium that secrete substances into ducts, onto surfaces of cells, or into the bloodstream. So let me write that up so you have a visual representation. Alright, so a gland, once again, cell or group of cells of specialized epithelium that secrete substances into one of three places: into a duct, onto the surface of a cell, or into the bloodstream. Okay, so to produce and secrete whatever they're making, it requires energy. Alright, so energy and secretion. What does that sound like? Moving something from inside the cell to outside the cell using energy. Well, I'll give you two words to think about. So cellular secretions use the process of exocytosis. And then if you want to go a step further, you know it requires energy, so we can say this is an active transport process. So this is a really good example of how we've seen the word glycoprotein. That didn't disappear from the first unit. We're seeing exocytosis and active transport. Those didn't disappear from the first unit. So if you haven't mastered that first unit of material, it's really important to go back and get these concepts down because you will use them the entire semester. I'll give examples in just a sec of each one of these. Okay, so before I give specific examples of these different cells, let's look at a few different classes of glands first. So first we'll look at an exocrine versus an endocrine gland. Alright, so an exocrine versus an endocrine gland. An exocrine gland is going to secrete into a duct. So when we go back and we look at these different places where they're secreting, we have one, into ducts. So that's going to be an exocrine gland, secretes into ducts. Well, you might ask yourself, what's a duct? A duct is a tube that carries you from point A to point B. That's all a duct is. It carries stuff, doesn't have anything special about it, just carries stuff from places from point A to point B. That's it for now for ducts. So most endocrine or exocrine glands we talked about are associated with digestion. So if you remember the pancreas, if you've taken a science class before, you've heard that the pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So it has those exocrine. It has an exocrine function of releasing digestive enzymes. So for example, the pancreas is going to release digestive enzymes. And then the endocrine function, the endocrine is an entire system that we get in the first part of the second semester. So the endocrine system is your hormone system. So, endocrine is going to be secreting into blood vessels, or we can say endocrine glands are ductless glands. They don't have a duct associated with them. And endocrine glands are going to secrete hormones. So hormones, you can think of stuff like estrogen, testosterone, growth hormone, cortisol, all these different things that you might have heard in your life. These are hormones being secreted into the bloodstream. So again, some organs have both exocrine and endocrine glands, like the pancreas. So the part of the pancreas secreting digestive enzymes into ducts, that's an exocrine function of the pancreas. And then whenever you're secreting insulin and glucagon into the bloodstream, those hormones, that's an endocrine function. So if I wanted to draw a duct, let's draw a duct. This is just a tube that's carrying me from point A to point B. In our example, we have the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to secrete things into this duct, and they're going to end up in the small intestine. You don't have to memorize this right now. I'm just trying to show you. From point A to point B, we're going to secrete digestive enzymes. And since it's secreting into a duct, we know this is an exocrine function. Now we can take that same organ, the pancreas, and now we can have a blood vessel. And it doesn't really matter what that second one is. So now we can secrete things like insulin and glucagon. These are hormones. These are hormones that are going into the bloodstream. So we know hormones, blood vessel, this must be endocrine. So that's how we're going to separate endocrine versus exocrine. Is it using a duct? It's exocrine. Is it using hormones in the bloodstream? Endocrine. Now let's look at structural classification, which is basically unicellular versus multicellular. And really we're going to focus on unicellular. So this is glands based on structure. So we have a unicellular gland. Unicellular. And we have multicellular. Unicellular is really what we're focusing on right now. And the unicellular gland, we're only talking about one of them really, is the goblet cell. We can call it a mucous cell. They're cuboidal. Okay, so all those words, goblet, mucus, cuboidal, all should give you the word secretion. Okay, so we've already talked about going into a duct. That was our exocrine. We talked about the bloodstream as endocrine. Now we need to look at onto the surface of the cell. That is going to be our unicellular goblet cell. Unicellular gland, call it a goblet cell. This is going to produce and secrete mucus. And this could secrete into a duct or onto the surface of the cell. I don't have a great one for secreting into the duct yet. I can't think of one off the top of my head. But on the surface of the cell, this is where we're really looking at, because if you talk about the digestive tract or you talk about the respiratory tract, you know you have mucus in your lungs. That's why you can cough it up when you're sick. And if you guys remember, in most bio classes, whenever you talk about the stomach, you talk about how it's super acidic, and this is super acidic pH, and we have that protective layer of mucus that prevents the stomach from eating itself. So that's why this is important. This is going to help prevent the digestion of the stomach itself, and it's going to help in this respiration. That's just two examples. Okay, so let's see that. Let's see the lining of the stomach. Here's my lining of the stomach. This is going to be my goblet cell or mucus producing cell, and then this is going to be a cell. We'll get into it next semester, but this cell is going to produce hydrochloric acid. All right. If I'm producing hydrochloric acid and I'm spraying it all over my stomach to help break down proteins and stuff, well, guess what? There's some proteins in your stomach because you got muscles. And if we have this hydrochloric acid destroying all this, that's not good for business. So what we do, we now have this mucus that's secreted onto the surface of the cell, just like that. And it's just going to ooze out. It's going to come over here, and it's going to start lining this. Okay, maybe another goblet cell, secreting mucus. So it's helping protect the stomach from digesting itself. Or we had that respiratory tract, where we had the respiratory tract, we had this mucus or goblet cell, and then we had that PCCE, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and we saw this working together where maybe I get some secretion of mucus, and it secretes all over this. And along with that, I trap a pathogen in these cilia so that it's trapped in the mucus, and now these cilia can wisp away. It can wisp away this pathogen out of our respiratory tract. So that's two examples of where you might see unicellular or goblet cells. So you know he loves these application-based questions. So instead of just telling you produces and secrete mucus, I'm trying to go into where you might see it and why. What is it actually doing? So in the stomach, why? What's the why? Protection from against this acid. What's the why in this respiratory tract? Helps trap pathogens. Okay. So that is unicellular versus multicellular, and now we have hit all of where they're secreting, which is into ducts, exocrine. Onto surface of the cell, we can see these goblet or unicellulars, and then into the bloodstream, these were endocrine. Last thing we're going to do is the functional classifications of glands. So this is basically how are they functioning? How are they secreting their secretory substances, whatever you want to say. So we have two different types, merocrine and holocrine. Let me write some stuff up and then I'll draw some pictures. Alright, so these merocrine glands are going to make their substances and they're going to store until release. So store secretions until release. Okay, and holocrine, what's going to happen is the cell is going to eventually, so you're going to produce and store. Okay, hold on. Merocrine, store secretions until release, and then once it releases substances into ducts without damage to the cell. Now, with holocrine, store secretions, produces and stores it in cell. Now, instead of releasing into the duct without damage to the cell, holocrine, the cell is going to slough off into the duct. And then the cell will burst open and it's going to release all its contents. So I'll draw a picture to show the difference. Cell gets destroyed in the process. Okay, so here's one duct. Here's a second duct. Let's do holocrine, merocrine. So for my merocrine gland, I have this cell. I'm just going to draw a circle for the cell, and the holocrine, I have a cell. So we're going to produce substance A in my merocrine and substance B in my holocrine. And now let's look at the next step. So we have this and now it's ready to release. So in a merocrine gland, it's going to secrete A into a duct. Nothing that fancy. B, this is lining this duct and the whole cell is going to go in there. So now we have B, that's the whole cell. So it's no longer lining the duct. And then eventually the cell is going to burst open. Excuse me. And then B will just be in the duct. So here, you still have the cell there at the end. Here, no cell at the end. So holocrine glands are going to have a lot of replication. What is the cellular division that almost every cell except sex cells do? What kind of cellular division? So that's mitosis. I want to give you a chance to practice. So holocrine glands have high levels of mitotic activity. High levels of mitosis. And this is important because, remember, this cell is going into the duct and dying. So now I need a new cell to then produce more of substance. Oops. I need a new cell to produce more of substance B. So we have a lot of mitotic activity. How can you remember holocrine versus merocrine? If you remember holocrine, the whole cell goes into the duct. So that's how you can differentiate these. So a few different questions. Let me try to think of something. Give me a sec. I'll pause and try to think of something. All right, here's a question from my practice test. Here we go. Pancreatic amylase is secreted by the acinar cells of the pancreas. This molecule travels through the pancreatic duct where it eventually enters the small intestine to break down sugars. So there's a lot of information here that you've never heard before. Let me read it again. Pancreatic amylase is secreted by the acinar cells of the pancreas. This molecule travels through the pancreatic duct where it eventually enters the small intestine to break down sugars. What kind of glandular tissue best fits the description above? What kind of molecule is pancreatic amylase? So, you can go back and replay the question. And now let me give you your four choices. A, exocrine gland hormone. B, endocrine gland hormone. C, exocrine gland enzyme. D, endocrine gland enzyme. The word that you're looking for is either blood vessel or duct. What did you hear in this stem? You should have heard the word duct. If you think duct, do you think exocrine or endocrine? You should think exocrine. Then the next question is, what kind of molecule is pancreatic amylase? The choices are hormone and enzyme. You may have never seen pancreatic amylase in your life, but what do you know? We've seen ACE before. Okay, we did some ACEs in that first unit. So if you have something that ends in ACE, like amylase, that's an enzyme. So the answer to this question for what kind, and I know you can't see the question, so I know you're having to do a saw in your head, I apologize. But what kind of glandular tissue best fits the description above? That's an exocrine gland, because the pancreas is secreting into a duct. The other thing, what kind of molecule is pancreatic amylase? I see ACE, I immediately know enzyme. So the things that you didn't know were pancreatic amylase. You'd probably never heard of acinar cells. You didn't know about the small intestine. You didn't know they had an effect on sugars. But what you did know from what you've learned so far is ducts and the ending for ACE. I hope that was a decent question for you. I have, let's see, what do I have here? Cool, I have 44 questions for this practice test that you guys should get. So that's holocrine versus merocrine. Is there anything else you want to do before I end this video? I guess I can get some examples. Just in case like you see these specific words, you can get your head going in a certain direction. So merocrine. So what are some examples of glands that are merocrine glands? Salivary glands. That's an I right there. Sweat glands. So sweat glands, and then part of those pancreas glands that we talked about. Holocrine glands. The example he gave was a sebaceous gland, which is like a oil gland. Okay, sweet.